And we are from agriculture. And today, instead of really going into heavy deep biochemistry or anything like that, we're just going to stick to what were some of the things that we saw during 2020. What were prevalent brewing styles? What were things that certain breweries did to survive and also to separate themselves from the competition? This is, of course, all from our perspective from selling the yeast. So we've got an idea of what's getting brewed. Thanks, Julian. So just a little bit of background about ourselves, something that we find very important on that side for you guys. So culture is defined by three ways. Firstly, it's a shared way of life. It's defined by characteristics, features of attitudes, goals and practices. Number two, developing expert care and training. This is to develop the capacity for learning and interchanging knowledge for future brewers. And then, of course, the propagation of living material, which is a microbiological technique of culturing organisms in artificial media. And we think that these three definitions of culture is exactly what we are all about. We want to help teach, we want to extend the community, and we like propagating living material. So in 2014, we were all postgraduate students at the University of the Free State, homebrewers. We did all the varsity competitions. Sorry? Yeah, clear practice. Fancy way of saying using. Obviously, we developed a great love for the brewing industry. It's all about the people, it's all about the events, and it's just really something we love to be a part of. So in 2016, Kovsie Brewing was officially started at the University of the Free State. We have since spun out from there, and we're now known just as a craft brewing company, which was the best way of keeping our original branding, as it still stays KBC. It's just not Kovsie Brewing anymore. So this is all with the aims to start a brewing and fermentation school, which is still what we're aiming to do. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to have a big brewery, we'll be able to provide course material and hands-on training for brewers. It's at this point that we started to use only liquid yeast. We figured we'll save some money and we'll start propagating our own yeast in the labs. And we had more and more people asking us if we could also help them by giving them some of it. And it's at this point that we decided, well, let's try and make something of this. So we acquired TIA funding, identified a need for liquid yeast in South Africa, and started a business opportunity. We then started a yeast research and development initiative with the aims of developing, especially the University of the Free State culture collection. I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. This was to discover and elucidate new brewing strains, which we find is a fascinating field. So in 2019, we completely broke away from the University of the Free State. We are now independent. We are still renting lab space at the Department of Microbiology, which is an awesome place to be situated. We've got really world-class equipment. We've got the best laboratories who surrounded by some really, really clever people. And we also still have one of the largest yeast culture collections in the whole world, which we are still working on developing. And we've also completed several projects with what was then known as SAB, and we're still busy with working on some of the yeast culture collections. So the Department of Microbial Biochemicals and Food Biotechnology was started about 50 years ago with a primary focus on fermentation sciences. It was literally all there to work in the brewing industry. Completed hundreds of research projects with breweries from all across the world, and we still have all of these cultures for our use. We've got over 2,000 isolates of yeast. Some of them are from the tops of Everest down to the digestive tracts of butterflies from the Amazon, and of course from all of these amazing breweries from around the world. And we are still daily working on developing and finding out which of these yeast strains can actually have brewing potential. So just for a little bit of background before we get started on all the in-depth stuff, just to look at how fermentation works again. And we found that many people are big into brewing, but they sometimes forget about the simple steps in this. So when you pitch yeast into an aerated wood, you can see the blue line is basically the oxygen and the red line is the cell count. So when you pitch in the yeast, the first thing that they'll do is they're going to adapt to their new surroundings. They're going to start using up all of the oxygen. So especially when you're using dried yeast, this is very important because the freeze-drying process really hurts their cell membranes, and they need oxygen to be able to repair these damaged spots on the cell membranes. So they'll use all of the oxygen, they'll repair their own cell membranes, they'll replicate a few times, and then once the oxygen is done, that's when the fermentation will start. So during that time, oxygen goes down, cell count goes up, and fermentation starts. So fermentation will then range for as long as there's basically sugar available. During this fermentation period is when the yeast are eating all of the sugars and they're pooping out alcohol and carbon dioxide. So The pitch count is extremely important in mitigating several of these factors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ester formation a little bit later, but for instance, for generating higher ester formation in your beers, it's also important to control the amount of oxygen that you have available, the amount of sugar that you will have, and this will also lead to a lot of the flavors that you're going to have. Lots of people, and I saw this on all of the brewing platforms over the last few months, everybody asks, but how long should I leave my beer on the yeast? I mean, the packet says it's going to be a 7-day fermentation, can I take it off now? It's very important that you monitor your fermentation, make sure that you reach a stable terminal gravity, and in our honest opinion, we like leaving all of our beers on the yeast for at least a week or two. There's going to be no water lysis during this time, you don't have anything to be scared of in that regard, and the yeast are going to keep working. They're going to keep altering the flavor profile of the beer, they're going to mature your beer very nicely, and it's a really important step to leave the beer on the yeast for as long as possible. It will also help to clarify everything else. It's during this place where all the scrubbings of the BDKs will happen, it's going to take out all the oil flavors, and it's really going to develop that depth that you want. So, what I'm actually going to talk about is some of the trends in 2020 that we noticed. I'm going to talk a bit about the different beer styles we saw, the ways that breweries differentiated themselves, either for survival or just to stand out from the competition. I'm going to talk a bit about distilling, which is not really what we're here for, but it became a very big part of the brewing industry in the last while. Some of the popular yeast strains that we have, that we have seen and that were very popular, and what we learned about fermentation in 2020, because we are always learning something new about fermentation. We would like to tell you a bit about that. So firstly, and as you saw from Megan now, low alcohol and no alcohol beers were very popular over the last while. It is currently a massive international trend, and the reasons for it are absolutely vast. I mean, it's healthy for lots of people that don't really want the extra carbohydrates and all the extra sugars. They just want to have a nice drink that they can enjoy for the flavor, but it won't necessarily make them drunk. Prohibition was a big driving force behind this because you weren't allowed to produce alcohol, and lots of people made extra income by growing non-alcoholic beers. Of course, driving after consuming several drinks is no longer a problem then. You can enjoy quite a few beers. I know for you guys in Joburg and Cape Town area, that's very important. In Bloemfontein, it's not as important. Only seen 2 roadblocks for literally my whole life there. But for you guys, that's actually very important. In our case, it's like the police don't care. You're just going to knock over a few balls. Of course, you've got much less severe hangover symptoms if you're not consuming alcohol, which is also important. As I said, the lower calories are also important than the equivalent full-strength beers. Some of the cons, of course, as you can see, is the loss of flavor, the addition of a few steps in the brewing process, and of course, depending on the method that you're going to use, you're going to have a sugary taste and a much shorter shelf life. So, how are these non-alcoholic beers made? So, Megan obviously said quite a bit about this already, so I'm just going to gloss over. There are several ways of doing this. One of the most prevalent ways that we see at the moment is vacuum distillation. It requires some pricey equipment, and what basically happens is you draw a vacuum in the headspace of your still. This will allow you to be able to remove the alcohol at a much lower temperature, so you don't have to warm it up quite as much. This will, of course, still remove a lot of the flavor. It's still going to remove a lot of the other things that you really want. And like I said, it's very pricey. You get membrane filtration. So you get a membrane that's specific for this process. It allows alcohol and water to be removed, whereby the alcohol, color, and some of the flavor and aroma compounds will go through the membrane. Obviously, it's once again not a very ideal process to use. You are going to lose a lot of your flavor. Cold mashing was something very interesting that we found. So basically, you do a normal mash, except you don't allow the enzymes to do any conversions. Once again, you're going to be stuck with a lot of starches, you're going to be stuck with a lot of unfermentables, and it's going to lead to a less fermentable wood that's of course going to be sugary and not very nice to drink. So one of the big things that we got involved in this year, and I know we got lots of requests for this, was to work on the yeast strains that have the ability to produce these low alcohol beers. It's an attractive prospect because you're still going to get some fermentation profile, which is extremely important. I mean, most of the beer's flavor comes from the fermentation profile. So these low alcohol yeasts are a newer topic in the production of these low alcohol beers. So these are all non-Saccharomyces strains that cannot ferment maltose or maltotriose, which is some of the most prevalent sugars found in a wort. It's been an interesting journey in the sense of yeasts are always going to eat something, whether they can't eat those compounds or whether they can. The normal Saccharomyces type yeasts will eat the sugars and they're going to make alcohol and carbon dioxide. some of these strains are going to eat the sugars, but they're not going to make alcohol, but that means they make other compounds. In some cases, it might be lactic acid. I mean, like we saw with the Philly sour type Saccharomyces strains. They don't make the alcohol as much, but they will make lactic acid. So there's always going to be a byproduct. So looking for the right type of strain to do this is extremely important. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is one of the very promising ones. It's got limited maltose and maltose consumption, so it's going to ferment, but it's not going to ferment a very high beer. It's not going to be like alcohol that's going to repress its growth, and that's the reason it's not going to make a high alcohol beer, because it just can't use all the sugars that are going to be available to it. The same goes for the Pterospora and for the Zygosaccharomeces. They have an inability to ferment maltose and maltotriose, or a partial ability to do it. So these are the three most popular strains at the moment for achieving these low alcohol beers. We are still working on exactly how they can be used in a successful way with the brewers. Because we've had a lot of people who just want the yeast, but they haven't really got an idea of what they're going to do with it. So we want to experiment with it first and see exactly how we can advise people to better use it to reach a final a low alcohol product or no alcohol product that's going to be more palatable to use. We have quite a few interesting strains that we are going to be working on, and this is going to definitely be an area to watch over the coming years. So, what's kind of a swear word to most brewers, light lagers. It's been a massive, massive uptake for that this year. Well, over the past few years at least. If you've got any questions, you can honestly just ask straight through the presentation. Yeah.
The previous one was also the different ways of making low alcohol beers. I think one of the better ways I thought would be freeze distillation. Then you freeze most everything off, the alcohol sits on the top, you put off the alcohol and then keep that in. And use that to make
so use the ice plant then?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that could work, but obviously it's still going to be have the exact same drawbacks as the rest. Because you're going to have all of the water, some of the compounds, but most of those esters are going to be trapped in the alcohol part that you're going to pour off. I mean, if you could perfectly freeze it just to get the alcohol off, that would have been ideal.
Yeah.
But separating those fractions are going to be hard. So you're going to sit with the same thing. So it's going to be an effective way of making low alcohol beer, but it's still going to have all of the same drawbacks.
And with the extended time period.
Yeah, and an extended time period, and you have to freeze it, which is high in energy input, and all of that. Michelle?
Yeah, I think you actually did it very well. If you get alcohol as a solvent.
Things dissolve into alcohol. It's actually something we learned with making gin the last while. If you leave it too long, the juniper berries, the alcohol, the juniper oils dissolve into the alcohol, and then when you finally dilute it down, they knock out all of these oils, and you get a very hazy gin. And it's the same thing with the beer. Lots of those compounds get dissolved in the alcohol. They bind with the alcohol, and the minute you remove it, you're removing most of the flavors of these of your beer. So anyway, so light lagers. Any other questions? Everybody's still happy? So light lagers are extremely easy to produce. They take very low input, they're cheap to make, they've got a very large following of consumers. I mean, ask Dana. People like drinking light lagers. So they've got a large following. Many commercial breweries in South Africa have added this to their lineup over the last times. And I mean, if you look back to 3 or 4 years ago at Africa Brew, people would say, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to make a light lager. I'm sticking to my guns, we're going to do this. And they've all added light lager now. Because the whole point is you still need to have that turnover. You need to have that large volume style that's going to keep the cash flow going. So this has been very important. Sessionability after becoming a lockdown lightweight. That's what we experienced most. After lockdown, we couldn't drink beers all the time anymore. We can't have a pale ale or IPAs the whole day anymore. So light lager has become a nice alternative for when you're getting a little bit of the hop fatigue. So it's really still nice. So you're going to drink 2 IPAs, but you're still going to have them. You need a lighter beer to really carry you through a session. One of the game changers for us in this regard was the Oslo pack, but I'm going to talk about that in a while as well. This was an awesome thing for us, sour beers. And I'm mentioning the intentional sour beers. There have been lots of sour beers on the market that weren't intentional. Having an intentional sour beer. So having an intentional sour beer has been really exciting for us. We've seen an increased offering for sour beers from across South Africa from various breweries. There's been great diversity in the ways that they've been made, using great lactic kettle souring or barrel aging. Of course, like we spoke earlier with Trevor and Stefan making this real Berliner Weiss. So how does one do this? Kettle souring is obviously, in our case, what we prefer for getting a quick sour beer. So when you kettle sour, you're basically making the wort, you're adding the lactobacillus, and you're letting that do its job, making lactic acid from some of the very easily fermentable sugars over a period of 24 to 48 hours. This process does take time. Everybody's is different. I mean, we can send out an identical pitch to 50 different people, and all of them are going to have a different time for the souring. So it's really important to monitor your pH while this is happening. We like ethyl souring corn to produce a nice clean lactic acid, like you saw with Trevor's or the Quisters, or from some of the other styles that have been available here. It's a really nice clean lactic acid that it's made, and we always prefer using Lactobacillus brevis. It is just an awesome Lactobacillus to do this with. Of course, you've got barrel mixed population fermentation. So what would happen is you would add, especially Brettanomyces, you can add that either to the primary fermentation, so right from the start you add Brettanomyces. It's not very fast off the mark. Even if you have a massive pitch of bread going up front, it takes a while to really start developing all of the Brettanomyces brilliant funk that we know and love. So it gets added and it's going to slowly chew away and do its thing. The nice thing about bread is it eats the unfermentable sugars. So even if you have a primary Saccharomyces fermenting microbe, that's going to eat 95 to 99% of your sugars, and the Brettanomyces are only going to live off those little sugars at the end that the Saccharomyces couldn't eat. And that's more than enough for it to make all that it needs. One of the important things that we found, oxygen in Brettanomyces produces acetic acid, vinegar. So if you've got Brettanomyces, and that's one of the reasons why the wine industry doesn't necessarily like having Brettanomyces in the wine, because it's going to produce acetic acid. So the whole point is you need to keep the oxygen exposure for the Brettanomyces extremely low, otherwise you're going to produce vinegar. Like I said, Lactobacillus is awesome. Then you get other barrel microbes like Pediococcus, which has been a real problem for us to grow, because even a short exposure to oxygen really kills that off really quickly. So we're still working on being able to produce the Pediococcus, which I don't know if anybody here has ever brewed with Pediococcus. It's an interesting thing. When it gets into your beer, it makes it thick, like syrup, like properly stringy. And most people immediately get a massive fright and they chuck it. Sorry?
Slimy.
Yeah, slimy.
It's slimy, like
algae and
like
slimy.
algae.
Yeah.
Algae.
So, interestingly enough, that goes away. If you leave it for an extra week or two, that completely disappears and goes back to having a normal liquid consistency. So you just put the hammer through there. Next up, please. So some of the differentiation that we saw over the last while. New beer styles being developed by almost all breweries. Everybody have been trying to find something that's really going to give them a foothold in the market. Did you frog, you know? Yes. Well, everybody's trying to get some kind of a foothold, some kind of an angle to help sell the beers. So what we saw was lots and lots of breweries have moved over to the white yeast. It's a great yeast to use. It's robust, ferments fast, and it's got the ability to replace several traditional beer styles. For instance, with the Midwest, we found it produces a very nice, let's say, US-05 type beer, but with a higher ester profile. If you look at the Oslo, it's going to produce an extremely clean lager type, and I'm going to talk about that later. Or the Ragnarok is just, sometimes I can't even tell you what it's going to do, because it's got different results depending on what's going into your beer at all times. But one thing that we found that's pretty consistent is, especially at high fermentation temperatures with high original gravity, it's going to produce a nice like orange marmalade-y, citrusy note that in some beers are really, really nice. So another thing that we found interesting is lots of breweries are trying to generate IP for their beer. They want to have the ability to have sole ownership of what goes into it. So we've had lots of people saying, but we want to be the only people using this yeast. We want you not to be able to tell anybody what we are doing with this kind of thing. So lots of IP generation going on. We saw this with people with names of beers that have been a big issue over the last while. And everybody is seriously trying to, I would say, just hoard as much IP as they can for certain of their styles. We saw this was an interesting the year of the label. Companies like Richmond Hill Brewing Company, Kendall Brewing Company, you can see with Couple Quisters, with Megan's new labels, with Michelle's new labels, everybody, it's an exciting time for the packaging industry in South Africa with really pretty cans coming out, pretty bottles coming out. It's really nice to walk into a store and you see this brilliant array of beers, it looks nice. It's been very exciting for us. One of the major things that we also saw was once-off small batches. Lots of breweries moving over to, we are no longer doing the traditional 4 styles of beer and we're going to pump them out. This is like 200 or 400 litre once-off batches. They get a special label, a special can, and we're only brewing it once. Unless it's really successful, in which they might do a second release. And we found this was a great way to keep momentum going for some growth for some of the breweries. interesting beer styles coming out, interesting beers to drink, but not necessarily something you want to be pumping out month after month, which is really something that we've also looked at for differentiating your offering a little bit. So you still have one or two traditional styles that you're doing, but then have one score for little release batches, and we really thought that was awesome as well. Thanks, Julian.